Hello everyone, I am Olga Atamanova. I'm glad to welcome you to Media Center Ukraine. We have invited you to take part in the presentation of an analytical analysis, the policy of Russia on the destruction of the identity of children on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, results of 2024. It is not a secret that when the war started in 2014, on the temporarily occupied territories, Russia is consistently implementing the policy of removing the Ukrainian identity of children and youth. So Almenda organization is monitoring the situation with the violation of human rights of children in the temporarily occupied areas. Our speakers today are Mariia Sulialina. She is head of the center, Almenda Center. Online we have Anastasiia Vorobiova. She is the author of this analysis, and she is scientific assistant in the Institute of Legal Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Also, we have Valentina Potapova. She is the head of the Direction of National Advocacy in Almenda. Hello, and there's a presentation. The main task of our analysis was to systematize the changes that took place in 2024 as far as the pressure against the children in the occupied territories is concerned, indoctrination that's going on, in order to highlight the systemic character of nature of Russian actions. If we are talking about children in the temporarily occupied areas, we're talking about 1,600,000 children from 0 to 18 years of age, and we have to lean upon the data provided by the occupation authorities. Kids who live there are under systemic pressure. We've been monitoring this situation since 2014, and we see how the situation only becomes worse year in, year out. We have to take note of what is going on in order to implement countermeasures on the part of Ukraine to provide for the access of those children to Ukrainian education and to create some conditions for their reintegration. But we also have to see who are responsible for the destruction of identity policy. We have concentrated on several factors that are there in the occupied territories. The first factor is the destruction or removal of anything Ukrainian, and you see the occupied and the next peninsula of Crimea. We see that at the moment only 0.5% of children in Crimea learn Ukrainian, while when they were within Ukraine, 100% of kids had access to Ukrainian language. You can see how the situation forms about the access to Ukrainian language in other occupied territories. But, you know, when we check the information that we get from the occupational authorities, we see that real access is not there. De facto, the indicators are even lower than the occupation authorities quote. There's also militarization of education, and one of these factors is the activity of cadet classes. As you see in Crimea, there are 260 cadet classes, and compared to last year, it is 63 classes more during the first half of the academic year, of the learning year. The so-called Minister of Education in Crimea points out the importance of cadet classes, and I think that we will see the increase in this trend. And the danger is that the kids are being trained to become military from the very start. When they start to attend the school, they have to become either military or part of the law enforcement bodies of Russian Federation. This is the pattern that is going on, and we see that it's going to only become more, to become stronger this year, because in Russia this year, 2025, is proclaimed to be the year of the motherland's defender, and you see that we have found cadet classes in Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, which were part of which were occupied in 2022. The youth policy in the Russian Federation is one of essential tools to influence the awareness of children, because it pertains to youth movements, to special events, to the conditionally patriotic events which are really aimed at the russification of our children, and it is being implemented through youth camps and youth programs. We see how the dynamics is growing, and it only says us that Russia will allocate even more money for the youth policy, but it also tells us that we should pay more attention to the implementers and those who are responsible for the implementation of the so-called youth policies of Russian Federation. We have to work at the level of sanctions, at the level of our legislation. We have to launch cases against them, because part of the people who are implementing the youth policy on the occupied territories are citizens of Ukraine. And this is, of course, the issue of responsibility of collaborators. We have to understand very clearly what are we going to do with our youth policy in order to react to those challenges. I think that Valentina will be talking in detail about this, about our proposals. Talking about youth movements, we see a rather big number of kids who are involved into youth movements. We have chosen several movements which are most active in the occupied territories. Orlata, Pershi, Pervaya. If we're talking about Pervaya, the first movement, which started to work in 2022, we already see very high figures and numbers of the involved children. In spite of the fact that part of the people responsible for this movement are under sanctions, this still tells us that we should strengthen the sanction instrument and broaden the circle of the people who are under sanctions. We don't see the fall in activity of this movement. We see that they are gaining in scope. And this, of course, proves that the Russian Federation does not plan to stop. They do not plan to. All the talk about the potential freezing of the conflict tells us that Russia actually is raising its potential and still prepares kids to become part of the Russian army. There's also another Unarmia, Young Army movement, which is in fact part of the Russian armed forces. We've seen their dynamics for 2025 and 2024, and you see that their dynamics are quite fast, from 40 people in 2016 in Sevastopol to 17,000 this year, or for instance in the occupied territory of Kherson territory from 200 to 600 over 1 year. This is rather high, especially if we take into account the resistance that is still going on in those oblasts. In Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, Ukrainian kids still remember the Ukrainian system of education. They have not been exposed to the pressure for such a long time. When we talk about Unarmia, we are talking about specific events and measures of military direction, special camps where explosives are used, the School of Future Commanders, training to perform different orders. We have this all in our analysis, in our paper, because this all shows us the scale of how they prepare our kids for the future occupation. And we also see here a number of crimes perpetrated against our children, not only the raising of our kids' identity, but also the propaganda of the future service in the occupational forces. There's also quite a lot of violations of conventional clauses. Another movement that I would like to point out is Orlята России, the young eagles of Russia. This movement is focused on little kids, on the kids who are most exposed and most inclined to be influenced, and they can be influenced quicker, especially when we talk about Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblast territories, which were under occupation for 11 years now. These kids have never lived in the territories which were not controlled by the Russian Federation. They were born under Russian occupation already. I think that this is a very dangerous movement which has been rather overlooked. We hear a lot about the movement of the first and the movement and Unarmia, but we do not hear much about Orlята России. I'd like to dwell on some examples. I have dwelled on some examples. You can find more in our analytical paper, but the patterns that we have seen in 2024, they are not chaotic. We see the same actions in different occupied territories, the same programs in different occupied territories. We see how systemic Russia's work is, and we see how they systemically spread the network of those movements in every occupied territory, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less success, but they do it. So we have to draw attention to this, because these are our children who are there and who are suffering from this pressure every day. 1.6 million of our kids are there in the temporarily occupied territories. Do we understand which percentage of these kids is involved in those movements? You see the numbers. You see the numbers here. We have not calculated the percentage, but we can come back to the figures, and we have this in absolute numbers. There's another issue. How many people have already gone through this system and who were drafted to the occupational forces and who have actually fought against their own country? We tried to find this data, but we failed. But we know that such things happen because there are some memorial plaques in the occupied territories, in schools, and we see there are people who were kids when the occupation started and who were actually involved in cadet classes or some other movements, and who have died during this war, in this war. So we have actual examples of the use of those children when they reach 18 years of age. Now we're going to Anastasiia, who is online. What about the changes in 2024? Yes, I hope that you see it, hear me too. Thank you, Mariia, for such a saturated presentation. I will be talking mostly about the quality side of this phenomenon. What were the legal changes that happened in Russia over 2024? Because although this pertains mostly to the Russian federal legislation, you can understand that in the occupied territories, which are under the effective control of Russia, this legislation directly influences what's going on in the occupied Ukrainian territories and what are the actions of the occupational authorities against Ukraine. I would like to thank very much the team of Almenda for the work that they are doing and for the suggestion that I should have systematized this information. I thank wonderful documenters who helped me. Now I will share the presentation. I would like to tell you about, first of all, the amendments to the 2012 federal law on education in Russia. This is the major law there, and it provides for the major directions of the Russian educational policy, including the occupied territories of Ukraine. I will tell you about the forced issuance of Russian passports in the occupied territories, and they say, the occupational authorities say that it was completed in January this year. Also about the youth policy and changes to strategic documents of Russia, which de facto are not legislative acts, but because they are program documents, they influence the changes and amendments to the law in Russia. So we'll start with the amended 2012 federal law on education. There were rather essential changes. In 2024, all the teachers who teach in Russia and on the occupied territories have to take into account and teach on the basis of the traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. And they say that this includes patriotism, the respect to the memory of the defenders of the motherland, and heroic feats of the people of this motherland. And of course, this shapes the positive attitude to the Russian army, to the service in the Russian military, and even positive attitude towards the so-called heroes of the so-called special military operation. They removed the requirement for parents to give permission to involve kids into the lessons of labor, and now they do not have to obtain parents' permission in order to involve kids to, for instance, sew the clothes for Russian military, or even to the assembly of drones that will then fly to Ukrainian cities. So this labor educational process has the essentially militarist nature. Then the subject labor technology has a special module which is called robotics, where they study the drones, unpiloted vehicles, aviation systems, and we quote a very bright example in our paper how these measures are being introduced in the occupied territories. For instance, in the boarding house for children with disabilities in Oleshki, saw classes with those kids about how they operate the drones, even though those children are not supposed to be drafted into the Russian army. Also, the subject which is called the Foundations of Security and Motherland's Defense for pupils of classes 8 to 11. And we see here the example of such measures, how children were involved in this course on managing drones and how they conducted military preparation in the territory of the occupied Crimea. As far as forced issuance of Russian passports is concerned, as of from the 1st of January 2025, the residents of the temporarily occupied territories who do not have a Russian passport are being bestowed the status of foreign citizens or citizenless, or people without citizenship, and they may be deported from these territories. In January 2025, Russian government officials said that the passportization of the population of the occupied territories was successfully permitted, but the Russian passport means that young men have to be registered for possible service in the Russian army, and it is important to say that this forced passportization and the drafting of young men in the temporarily occupied territories is the continuation of the Crimean scenario, when the boys, after 18 years of age, were taken for service in the Russian army, which was contrary to the international law. And last year, the first drafting of young men in Zaporizhia region, in the occupied part of Zaporizhia region, started. It is important also to point out that one of the measures that makes young men join the Russian army is not only the forced passportization, but also softer measures like meeting of representatives of the occupational authorities with pupils. Here we quote Kherson Oblast, the occupied part of Kherson Oblast, but it happens elsewhere as well. We also, together with Almenda, conducted a large-scale research of Russian youth policy. Here you see the analytical paper published last year as far about the youth policy of the Russian Federation as a tool of the destruction of Ukrainian identity on the temporarily occupied territories. I do advise that you familiarize yourself with this document. It is important to point out that by the end of 2024, the there were amendments to the Russian law on the youth policy, and they actually bestowed the right to the authorities, including the authorities in the temporarily occupied territories, to form different so-called moral values, like respect to the history and to the glory and to the victories of the past in Russia, and the militarist component is brightly present in the formation of the youth policy. They also have adopted the new strategy and the implementation of the youth policy with a special focus on performing the constitutional duties to protect the motherland. In this case, they mean Russia, and they also have the nationwide project of the government of Russia about the upbringing of the youth in the spirit of the Russian patriotism. We have specifically researched the youth policy in the occupied territories. In all the occupied territories, we have analyzed the legislation that was adopted by the occupation authorities. It does contradict the norms of international law, and we see that they pass specialized law, and they allocate quite a lot of money for the implementation of youth policy. If you're interested, you should get acquainted with this. Here we see one of the examples to implement this policy. There's a separate Ministry for Youth, the so-called Ministry for Youth in the occupied Zaporizhia Oblast. They get quite a lot of money, and they are active in implementing this policy. And one of the key moments that we saw were the changes in Russian strategic documents, which define the basic policy of Russia in relation to the temporarily occupied territories. One of the brightest examples, to my mind, is the strategy for the state cultural policy until 2030, where they say that the most important task is the integration of the so-called new subjects of the Russian Federation into the Russian cultural and humanitarian space. And this is one of the key tasks of Russia, to make these territories part of their cultural humanitarian space. There's also a resolution on the national aims of the development of Russian Federation until 2036. They talk about patriotism a lot there, and they say that they have to involve no less than 75% of young people in patriotic education programs. And of course, this is russification, indoctrination, and militarization. In July 2024, there was a rather interesting document about the preservation and strengthening of the traditional Russian spiritual and moral values, and about different measures of patriotic direction with the aim to counteract the attempts to diminish the significance of Russian culture and discredit the Russian world, its traditions and ideals. So we see that there's a lot of actions in the occupied territories to protect this Russian world and to root out anything Ukrainian. They also propagate the Russian vision of history, and the first decree that Putin has approved after his re-election as a president was about the basics of the state policy of Russian Federation in the sector of historical education, which of course says that the historical education in Russia has to shape the nationwide, Russian-wide citizens' identity and to strengthen the unity of the Russian world based on the Russian traditional values. And of course, they also brand some of the territories as inherently Russian. History in Russia is acquiring even more importance, and to sum it up, I would like to dwell on the document adopted on the 24th of December of 2024 about the counteraction to terrorism in Russia, where Ukraine is directly mentioned as a threat to Russia, and they say that Ukraine is a hotbed of Nazi ideology and Nazi organizations, and Ukraine is, in fact, branded as a neo-Nazi state and one of the threats to Russia. And one of the tasks set before Russians is the removal of the sources of this alleged Nazi ideology. So they launch quite a lot of events in the temporarily occupied territories to counteract the so-called extremism. So we think that in 2025 they will even more often mention Ukraine and the necessity to fight against Ukraine. We see that there were quite a lot of changes in Russian legislation in 2024, which influenced the situation in the temporarily occupied territories. They are of a prominently militaristic nature. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Anastasiia. And now the question to Valentina. Let's talk about our actions. What are the actions that we should aim at in order to protect the security of our children? What tools do we have? Thank you. For this presentation, when we were talking about it, we have raised the question, is Ukraine ready for a long and systemic work to fight for the young people who are under occupation now. I think this is the key question that we as a society should ask ourselves. Let's try to honestly reply to this answer. Do we need this 1.6 million young people up to 18 years of age who compose something like 25% of the entire Ukrainian children's population? Do we reject those people, or do we actually start to fight for those children? Do we have a capacity and possibility to fight for those children? Do we have an access to those children? This is the major question. We don't have much access to them, but we have a small window which is called online learning, distance learning. This small window is still open, and we have 45,000 Ukrainian children in the temporarily occupied territories who are learning in Ukrainian schools online. Their numbers are dwindling because there's a huge pressure on the part of Russian authorities, and of course, even for any manifestation of Ukrainianism, like symbols or something else, or this is one of what we as Ukraine missed. Why the number of those children is decreasing? Let's try for ourselves understand that we have this window, we are using it, or should we close it altogether finally? And the society should answer this in earnest. At the moment, 16% of children of school age are studying in the occupied territories. This is, can they learn? Can they study in Ukrainian schools online? Well, maybe they can if we do something. What are the challenges facing? What challenges are facing us in order to keep this window open? The matter is that kids there are forced to learn according to the standards of the occupation authorities, and they cannot ignore this, because if they do not go to local schools, then their parents would be deprived of their parental rights. So those children suffer from a double overload because they study in local schools and online in schools on the free territory. But do we actually take into account the security risks that they face connected to the decree on extremism? Can we force Ukrainian kids who are studying online, make them learn the textbook on the subject which is called protection or defense of Ukraine? If such a textbook is found in their telephones, then they may face charges connected to extremism. And of course, the topics in history that the Russian Federation has defined very clearly about the activity of Ukrainian insurgents army, and also about different figures in Ukrainian history who are branded extremists in Russia. Should we offer our usual program on history to those people, kids who are studying online? There are also complications with documents, and there are administrative barriers. The kids cannot go to the free Ukrainian territories after they have graduated from the school in the occupied territories. We do not have cross-border, cross points anymore. And previously, those children who entered the free territory could get the Ukrainian passport, and now if they do this, they go through hell in order to get the Ukrainian passport. I do not advise anyone to go through these trials and tribulations. You will be lucky if you receive the Ukrainian passport after 3 months. If you don't have this document, you cannot work, you cannot go anywhere, and you may be stopped by the police. Of course, there's psychological changes and psychological barriers. You have moved to the free territory, you went through hell in order to obtain the passport, and now you are living in an entirely different environment. Do you have a free access to a psychologist who would work with you? An average person who lived there has not lost Ukrainian identity. They understand that their motherland is Ukraine, and every day their parents tell them, please do not say a word about this at school, because FSB, Russian Security Service, will be informed about this by your teacher or your classmates, and then they are told to do something like sew the clothes or masking for the so-called heroes of the special military operation. But you have to take part in this, and you do this and you understand that this is going to kill people in your motherland. So you lived with this for 11 years or something like this, and then finally you go to the free territory of Ukraine, and you want to be patted on your head for the fact that you have retained your Ukrainian identity. But no, they are being accused of being collaborators for living there. Why have you got the Russian passport in its time? Instead of saying, here's a warm bath for you, we have waited for you. Because the slogan, we are waiting for you, are not just letters in some big billboard. This is when we are really waiting for those people, where we can say, breathe calmly, here's a warm tea for you, and we want you to integrate into the Ukrainian society after the hell that you went through. You can talk to students who have told us about this. I remember one story with a student who he mostly studies online, but he lives in a dormitory, and he hasn't been out for half a year because he's afraid that he will be beaten because his Ukrainian is not very good, because he lived in the occupied territory. I can tell you what is going to happen to this guy, and he will go back where his parents are. Where are the psychologists who would go to them? You cannot live for half a year when you are suppressed by the fears that were imposed on this person there, because every day he was told that Ukraine is a Nazi state, you are being killed there, so of course there's the threat of losing your Ukrainian identity. And one of the threats when we talk about this 1.6 million young people is the cannon fodder for the Russian army. And of course they do not pity their own, and they would not spare people from the occupied territories. However, whatever they say, that those are inherently Russian territories, they are going to remain second class for them. Do we have any way to overcome these challenges? We should answer the question whether we are prepared to fight for this youth. And if we say, yes, we are ready, we are prepared, then we have to implement a systemic state policy on access to the right to education for children and youth from temporarily occupied territories at all levels. This has to be a concept. This has to be a document which is not only about the Ministry of Education, but also about the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, for youth policy, for social policy. This is the concept of the access to education. And there you have to have the Public Health Ministry when you have special protocols on the psychological aid for such kids. We have to implement specific state-run programs that would aim at support of those children. And when I'm talking about this, I mean that the state program is the program that has financing. You see how much money Russia is investing into our youth, how much money is being invested into the processes of reintegration of the youth in Ukraine. I remember the last program in 2021. These were special courses for children that included both social and psychological support. But then the full-scale invasion happened. Then, of course, providing support to children and youth from the temporarily occupied territories in their adaptation and integration into the Ukrainian educational system. And here we have to involve the entire society to support those children so that someone pays attention to this guy who hasn't left the dormitory for 6 months, so that his co-eds understand why he doesn't show out. Maybe knock on his door and say, let's go have some coffee, in order to understand the specifics of being from the occupied territories. Consolidation of efforts of state authorities and local self-government bodies, educational institutions, CSOs, and international partners to ensure that children and youth from temporarily occupied territories receive Ukrainian education, so that this window that I mentioned may even become a door through which young people would come to us. Sometimes I'm being asked whether I am sure that after the political indoctrination that they undergo there, they will come to us. Yes, if the door is open, then they'll come. Both Mariia and Anastasiia told us about the attention to the traditional moral and spiritual values of the Russian nation. This is neutral, but what's this in reality? This is the change of the role of a woman when the woman becomes a container for the future kids. You see this all the time. They are not ashamed of talking about this. This is also the subjugation to the strong authorities. Every person has a natural desire for freedom. These are their values, are the values of the closed society, closed world. And Ukraine is the proponent of open world. As a person who lived behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, you know, I was not very much suffering because I didn't have some food or whatever. I had this, but I suffered because of the lack of freedom. And when we opened this door, young people will come to us, because young people want freedom. They want free world. It is very important for us to say that we are prepared to defend and launch this front in the struggle, in the fight against the Russian Federation, because this is the fight for our youth. Thank you very much. I think this is a very important conversation, and all the points that you singled out. You know, recently there was a very inspiring story produced by the guy, a journalist from the occupied territory, about the 17-year-old Ukrainian boy who left the occupied territories and came to the free territory of Ukraine, overcoming all the barriers along his way. I think this is very, very important that we know about such people, although he lived there since he was 7. Thank you very much for your work. And the question about the adaptation of school programs, do you think that we have to develop separate school programs for children who live in the occupied territories, which will take into account the security challenges that they have? Yes. In order for this window to be open, the access to Ukrainian education should also take into account the overload that they have and the adapted programs. Of course, there should be adapted as far as security challenges are concerned. And there should be this civic education there. If we are talking about the loss of national identity, then this should not be mathematics, because honestly, they will learn mathematics in their Russian school. This should be civic education. And there we have to define very clearly what the narratives are that we should offer those children, and also what are the narratives that we should use to oppose the so-called traditional Russian values, the narratives of democracy, the narrative of peace, instead of the narrative of war that the Russian Federation is sowing. And this should not be like, let's take a textbook on civic education. This should be done by experts, by academics whom we have a lot in Ukraine. We have a lot of talented teachers who can write, compose such a textbook, especially for children who are in the occupied territories. Yes, this means money, but 1.6 million people, 16% of the kids of school age. Do we need them or don't we? We either do this or we do not. And this is a very important, probably the most important question to me. This is not the question to our state bodies. This is the issue for every one of us, for the entire society. Then we will be able to find money and build the whole system, not the reaction to situational challenges. Well, this looks like a roadmap for our authorities that have to consolidate the throng of efforts of different bodies. Who, in your opinion, should lead this process? Yes, this should be done by the Ministry for Education, but this should not be done bit by bit, a bit from the secondary education department, bit from the early learning department. There should be a special department responsible for the education in the occupied territories. There's a new project department in the education ministry. They have the coordinator there, and another project I may mention, the Education for Life. It is very hard to set up a special department, but this could be a special project. And of course, you can find quicker money for a special project from UNICEF, from UNESCO, but this should be told about in international platforms as well. And I think that the Ministry for Foreign Affairs should be involved in this. And of course, when we're thinking about the freezed conflict, part of the humanitarian negotiations that Ukraine is conducting through intermediaries, there should be the issue of the access to Ukrainian education. This should be one of the major issues in order to stop the pressure on Ukrainian children. But just imagine that they said, okay, we will no more pressurize your children. We will not object that our children, that the children who go to a Russian school also have access to Ukrainian education. But we don't have tools to provide to those children if there is such an opportunity. We need at least a year to develop such tools. Any questions, dear friends, dear colleagues?
What can the West do to help? What can the outside world do to help Ukraine now? We know America is changing, but the base supporter civilians that watch the situation often say, what can they do, because they feel helpless, so they want to know that. And second question is, do you have examples of children who have returned where you see deep indoctrination already, where it's something you can study now to see how important time will affect the situation. Дуже дякую.
Щодо вашого питання, що може зробити Захід?
Well, what the West can do, we can talk about different levels here. Maybe Valentina will talk more about national level. As far as international level is concerned, we should spread information. When I go to advocacy trips, I see that people do not know about the situation with children in the occupied territories. They know about deported children, about Russian crimes against deported children, but they actually are very little aware about what's happening to kids in the occupied territories. This should be done. As far as other levels are concerned, of course, this is sanction pressure. We see that this works, and we see changes in Russian management and governance when the sanctions are being introduced. We see, for instance, the Crimea Patriot Center, which became less active after the sanctions. Yes, the sanctions do not work in the scope that we would like them to work, but they do work. And of course, this should be across the board, because when there are sanctions from one country but no sanctions from another country, this does not help. Valentina also mentioned our international partners who are this or that way involved in the negotiation processes. This is about the issue of the children in the occupied territories. It should be voiced during international negotiations. We are voicing all the time the demand, the request to return all the deported children, but we should also voice very loudly the demand to give access to Ukrainian children in the occupied territories. Vladislav Gavrilov, Skhid SOS, and a fellow at the Georgetown University. Valentina has very clearly emphasized the major task for us. Do we need these 1.6 million children? Maybe this is the major question, which is a key for the solving of other questions. My question is going to be rather practical. We have talked to children who were coming from the occupied territories and joined the Ukrainian universities. Of course, many of us lived in dormitories while students. Does there have to be a special program in order to integrate those children from the occupied territories so that they feel themselves as comfortable as possible in the milieu, in the surrounding of people from the free territories? There should be such a program, and there should be compensatory programs in order to restore cultural identity and Ukrainian language. This could be subjects connected to the history of Ukraine or citizens' identity, but this optional part should be, this variation should be necessary and obligatory for those people. I also suggested that there should be body programs in our universities, like what we use for foreign students. But of course, these are not foreign students. These are our co-citizens, compatriots who found themselves under occupation. But the algorithm of support should be used for such children, and the university management should be responsible for this. There should be also tutorship program and obligatory. You have to suggest this for free. Free communication, free visits to a psychologist or see free psychologist visits. You know, we met students at the Catholic University in Lviv. A girl came to us who said, you know, I was thinking quite a lot in order to decide whether I should come and see you because I'm from Donetsk and I lived there from 2014, and only in 2021 I joined the Ukrainian Catholic University. So I've been visiting a psychologist for 2 years already. However, when I was thinking whether I should go and see you, I was afraid that talking to you might be a trigger for me. And this was a trigger for me. I saw with my own eyes a girl who was for 10 years in occupation, who made a decision, who joined the Ukrainian Catholic University, whose family is in the occupied territory, and she pulls herself as Münchhausen by his ponytail. She sees the psychologist. I understand how much she has to work to earn money to pay for this psychologist, but she understands that without this, she could not become a full-fledged and full-scale citizen of Ukraine. So we should talk about these programs. We should adopt these programs, and they should be both on the level of universities and on the nationwide level. When we talk now about children and students who join from the occupied territories, we should understand that these are very strong people because they go through all this way in order to fulfill their decision. And what if we are returning and reintegrated a lot of those people? They will need even more help of psychologists. The cases that you mentioned are the cases of very strong people who found the strength in themselves to come to the free territory of Ukraine. But there's quite a lot of our people there who are not as courageous and as staunch that they can do this. So we have to take care of such programs for them even now. We should also provide online support from psychologists within the framework of online learning. This can support them and help them preserve themselves. Thank you very much.
Milano. Sorry, I would like to ask you, so it's 1,600,000 youth between 0 and 18 years old. I would say that from your point of view, it's easier to recover, to be in touch with youth from 2022, because the youth from 2014 has been now 11 years under indoctrination. So can you divide this number? Can you tell us how many are from the territory of between 2014 and 2022, and how many of these 1,600,000 are in the other territory which has been occupied since the last 3 years? This is the first question. Second, I don't know who of you mentioned this 45,000 youth who are following the online Ukrainian school programs. And you say they are diminishing for obvious reason. So can you tell us how many were 1 year ago? And is this 45,000 now? And a last thing, sorry if I can say, Valentina, I think, spoke about this. Clearly, you are not happy about the fact that this country, Ukraine, is not ready to, is not equipped to take back these people. You mentioned this guy who had been 6 months closed in his room, etc. Is it why? I mean, these people should be treated as heroes. These people are really strong people who are escaping from the occupation. And I can tell you, my fixer is from Donetsk. Until now, sometimes when you go to the checkpoints, the soldiers make a lot of problem to him. Consider him like a spy, why are you here, etc. So clearly, how do you see the fact that many youngsters and no youngsters who live in Ukraine, in the free country, in the free part, are sometimes badly treated or suspiciously treated by your authorities? Thank you.
Щодо першого питання, якщо ми можемо відкрити мою презентацію, там на першому слайді в нас є розбивка.
Let's open my presentation again. We have maybe some technician can do this. Please open Maria's presentation. Approximately 600,000 kids are from the occupied Crimea. I do not remember about Luhansk and Donetsk region. Okay, we're going back. So you can see there the numbers in the occupied territories. Crimea and Sevastopol together 500,000. In Luhansk and Donetsk region, we do not have percentage about the territories occupied before 2022 and after 2022, because the authorities there do not do this, but we can very approximately compare them to the numbers that were there in 2021. And we see almost 200,000 kids in Zaporizhia region and to 150,000 in Kherson region. And of course, there's difference. The people who were the children who occupied, whose territories were occupied in 2022, they had their schools relocated and they had retained their access and connection to the Ukrainian school. The kids in Crimea have lost this link and they had to look for the school by themselves. This was one of the conclusions outcomes that Ukraine has taken, outtakes. In Crimea, 131,000 people graduated from Russian schools in Crimea, and we have not a single person in Crimea who would study according to the Ukrainian program. But of course there are pro-Ukrainian people there, but they are in a more complicated situation. As far as the numbers are concerned about those who study online under temporary occupation, last year there were 56,000 such kids, and now around 45,000. So we have lost 11,000 students in this respect. But the biggest loss here is when they enroll children in the first grade, because it is very hard to teach kids in the first grade online. And something like 30% was either 38. The decrease in the enrollment to the first grade amounted to 38% in either Zaporizhia or Kherson region. So there should be different programs also and different calculations for kids in the elementary school and further education. Let's be honest, the Russian Federation will teach these people how to write and read. But of course, we should pay attention to value programs about our values and our notions, our democratic values, which are characteristic of the European society and European civilization. As a teacher in my previous life, I can tell you that we have quite a lot of developments, good developments in this. As far as heroism is concerned, I do agree with you that these children are heroes, but the complexity of the situation is that it is hard to convince the society that they are heroes. Those are rather closed people, children. They cannot be public. You remember you mentioned the guy from Kherson. If there were quite a lot of such stories, it would help. But they understand that their parents are in the occupied territory, and they understand that as soon as they become public, their parents will be visited by the FSB. That's why our organization and our partners like SHID, SOS, Donbass, SOS, and other organizations who, together with Almenda, fight for the right to education for the children in the temporarily occupied territories, we then could talk about this heroism. We still have some questions. I'm Valeria from the Eastern Variant. I'm coordinator of the hotline for the people from occupied territories. After the liquidation of the reintegration ministry, its functions were dispersed among different ministries. Do you think that these ministries have already started to perform their functions in order to support our youth in the temporarily occupied territories? We also do not yet see the work of these new ministries, to be honest, and the transformation of the Ministry of Reintegration caused the fact that the public NGOs that are working with invisible children, I will tell you that we have quite often told those children invisible children, as opposed to the visible children who were deported. And we have again to work with different ministries to come to them again, to talk to them about these problems. We need time here, and this time is lives of those children. These are fates of those children. We are not in contact too as yet. Thank you very much. Thank you for the work, both Almenda and all others who work with this. We hope that our state will have enough strength to be involved in this work. We also want to thank our defense forces and our translator who worked with us for 80 minutes. Glory to Ukraine.